I had an elaborate introduction ready for our next speaker, but we're already almost 10 minutes into her time. Her credentials are impeccable. Air Force Academy graduate, Rhodes Scholar. She's packed more into her career, whether as an Air Force officer, a National Security Council staffer, a congresswoman, or even the president of a major university. But I'm most proud of the challenges in her current role, whether it's driving the new thinking, whether it's air superiority, whether it's space superiority, or the nuclear triad recap. Please welcome Secretary Wilson.
Jim, thank you very much. I'll talk about a few things with respect to the Air Force budget, the fiscal year 19 budget, and then mostly open it up to questions that any of you may have of me. The fiscal year 19 budget for the Air Force really is a budget that is driven by the National Defense Strategy. And you may wonder if that's really the case because the National Defense Strategy only came out in January and our budget was shortly after that. The last draft of the National Defense Strategy, which I saw in its 8 months of iteration, had number 67 on it. So this was a strategy that was iterated through the Defense Department, and even though I would not say that I made any significant contributions to it, it was done in a way that allowed us to start to design our programs to take into account a significant shift in national defense strategy, and in particular, to recognize explicitly the reemergence of great power competition. And that allowed us to frame our budget to make some significant changes in programs. Of course, right now, we are waiting for two budgets. We are still waiting for the fiscal year 18 budget, and we are about 6 months into the fiscal year, which is always a reminder to us that the continuing resolution, successive continuing resolutions, and even more than that, sequester, which the Air Force went through about 5 years ago, has done more to damage the United States military than anything our adversaries have done. So a return to some stability and certainty in budgeting is probably one of the most important things our nation can do. And then in that regard, the recent 2-year budget deal is a real welcome sign that with respect to national security, we can get back to a kind of regular order to take things off of cruise control and let the Congress and the administration run the budgeting process in a more normal way. For the United States Air Force, the National Defense Strategy tells us to focus on what we call the high-end fight, which means the fight against potentially a near-peer competitor. For us, China and Russia. We focus primarily on China in the Air Force, not because of their current capability, but because they are modernizing much more quickly than the Russian threat. And so for us, that is the pacing threat. The National Defense Strategy also tells us where to take risk and where to make choices to choose not to do things. Now, having done this in different ways and from different positions for a long time, we've all seen those kinds of strategies, whether in business or in government, that is hortatory and tells us things to do, but doesn't really tell us what not to do. And it's much less useful when you go in that direction. Then this National Defense Strategy takes on some of those hard decisions and particularly guides us to divest ourselves of capabilities that are unlikely to survive in a highly contested environment, and to try to develop capabilities that are lethal and ready in a contested environment. It also tells us to continue to restore the readiness of the force. In our first budget, in the end of fiscal year 17, we got an infusion of money to try to stem the decline in readiness, and fiscal year 18 budget starts to turn the corner. It's stabilizing and recovering when we get it. But fiscal year 19 begins what we hope is a steady path to recovery. Readiness for the Air Force is first and foremost about people, because in the wake of sequester, the United States Air Force cut 30,000 people from the force, 10 fighter squadrons, in the hope that perhaps we could disengage at that time from the Middle East and restore the force. But that didn't happen. And in 2014, ISIS declared its caliphate, and the Air Force did what the Air Force always does. We surged to the fight. That means that we continue to have a high operating tempo, even higher than pre-sequester, and we've been burning out our people. The only way to address this is to try to gradually increase the size of the force so that we're able to conduct the missions that the nation asks us to do without burning out our people. In fiscal year 19, that is an increase of about 4,700 people. Over the 5-year period, we will increase the size of the active Guard and Reserve force to about 339,000 people in the Air Force. The budget also, and the Nuclear Posture Review also, reaffirms the commitment to the nuclear triad. And we have modernization of the nuclear triad across the board. The Air Force is responsible for 2 legs of the triad, the airborne leg and the missile fields in the Great American West. But while we often talk about the ground-based strategic deterrent and the long-range standoff weapon and the purchase of the B-21 bomber, which are all in our budget, there's one other element that we're paying important attention to that the Air Force is responsible for about 3/4 of it anyway, and we share these responsibilities overall with the Navy, and that is nuclear command, control, and communications. It's something that's not often talked about, but it is modernized in our budget, and it's very important. The United States Air Force is facing a bow wave of modernization over the next 10 years, and it's not just in one area. It is fighters, and bombers, and space assets, and tankers, and the nuclear deterrent, and command and control. In every area of our mission, we are looking at modernization. And we have to do that cost effectively across the board. So there are a number of areas where this budget sees some change. With respect to air superiority, we are pursuing an integrated family of systems designed and intended for the high-end flight. But we also recognize that in this contested environment where we may have some 5th-generation aircraft that are quarterbacking the fight and penetrating contested airspace, it will be a mixture of 4th and 5th-generation aircraft that actually win the fight in the end. And so we are modernizing and upgrading our F-16s, our F-15s to retain that affordable capacity in addition to continuing the purchase of the F-35 and looking at a family of systems for highly contested environments with a renewed emphasis on electronic warfare. So in addition to air superiority, one of our missions for the United States Air Force is space superiority. Nobody does space as well as the United States of America, and our adversaries know it. As a result, they have been developing capabilities to deny the United States the use of space in crisis or war. The Director of National Intelligence recently testified on threats on Capitol Hill in the beginning of the budget season set of testimonies and explicitly recognized and said publicly that China and Russia are developing the ability to deny the United States the use of our satellites. Our responsibility as the Air Force is to move faster to defendable space, and our budget makes some significant changes with respect to that. With space-based infrared, which is our indications and warning system for missile launch, we have shifted to a defendable architecture. We are increasing our ability to protect what we have on orbit. We are planning to launch jam-resistant GPS satellites for position, navigation, and timing, and a number of other particular satellite programs and developments to be able to survive, to take a punch, and keep on providing the exquisite capability that the United States Air Force is relied upon for in space. I cannot think of a mission that the military carries out today that is not in some way dependent on space. And we need to ensure that those capabilities are available in crisis or war. We are also making a shift in this budget to multi-domain operations. This is a different concept in a way, and for the Air Force, we do a lot of command and control and communications, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But it's even more than what we're doing in command and control. We are moving from interdependence with our other services to a deeper integration. in air and space and ground and sea and undersea. In the Kosovo conflict, when we talked about joint operations, what that really meant was that, okay, the Air Force will take the east side of the country, the Navy takes the west side of the country. And that was what we did. It wasn't really interdependence. It was kind of simultaneous operations and deconfliction. Through 27 years of continuous air combat operations in the Middle East, we have come to a much deeper interdependence. There is one air tasking order, and it involves 27 different countries, and for the United States involves Army, Navy, Marines, and in some cases Army, Navy, Air Force forces all together in an air tasking order, as well as our allies. So we are much more interdependent, but we are trying to deepen that even further with integration and really working together at a level to create joint effects on the battlefield that no one service can do alone. And I see that in a number of places when I travel the world and look at what we're doing with joint operations. And one of the things that's interesting to me, every senior officer in the military today grew up post-Goldwater-Nichols. And so our senior service members, and even there's no one in the military today that doesn't understand the importance of truly joint operations. And that's different from, frankly, when I joined the Air Force a very long time ago. So multi-domain operations are moving forward. For us on command and control, we have made a significant shift with respect to a plan of a program called JSTARS in our budget. 1991, at the opening of when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, in 1991, the United States built a coalition to drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. At the time, I was a staff member on the National Security Council staff for the first President Bush. And there was a revolutionary capability to be able to see things moving on the ground, to have air traffic controllers in the back of a 707 with a huge radar on the belly, and to be able to watch across the forward edge of a battle area and see forces massing and call in strikes from both air and ground to prevent that attack from ever even happening. It was revolutionary capability at the time. It was pushed forward to the Persian Gulf the day before the air war launched. And it was actually manned by Northrop Grumman engineers who were civilian volunteers because it was still an experimental airplane. Today, that airplane is still in service with the United States Air Force. And we need that battle management capability. But the requirement was initially written to say we want a new platform, an airframe, to replace what we had before. That wasn't the right question. The question was, how should we do battle management, command, control, and communications in a future fight? Because we have so many more technologies available to us today than we had in 1991. 1991 was 2 years before America Online started sending us those square floppy disks for free email. Right? 1993 was the first 20-ounce cell phone that Bell South started selling for $900. Technology has moved us forward so that we are able, we believe, to have distributed sensors fuse the data from space, air, ground, sea, and give better awareness in a broader area than a single airplane can do, flying a loop over the forward edge of the battle area. Even more important, in a contested environment, let's say if we had a crisis in Europe, on day one, General Scaparrotti is going to want us to be able to provide battle management, command, and control, and we wouldn't be able to do it because it's a contested environment and JSTARS wouldn't survive. We have an obligation to try to get the combatant commander what he needs. And so our budget shifts to disaggregated sensors and fused data and information for battlefield management, command, and control, and proposes to cancel the legacy JSTARS replacement. We think that that's the right answer, and it was driven by the National Defense Strategy. Finally, I'd mention light attack. It's something that we have included in our budget. We started an experiment last year. Chief of Staff of the Air Force sent a one-page memo out to industry saying we want to do an experiment with light attack aircraft. Had 4 more pages of kind of parameters of what we were talking about. So 5 pages total in March. And by August, we had 4 aircraft sitting on the ramp at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico for testing. The test report was completed by December, and we've decided we're going to test 2 more airplanes on sensors, concepts of operation, maintainability, and do some more testing with 2 aircraft over the next 6 months or so. And then we will make a decision on how many the United States wants to buy. We want this to be coalition at the core because this effort does 2 things. First, light attack is much less expensive and can operate in a permissive environment. It's much less expensive to operate, not only to purchase, but to operate. By using light attack aircraft, we can free up some of our high-end 4th and 5th generation aircraft to be training for the high-end fight and help to restore our readiness in highly contested environments. It also allows us to pursue that thread of the National Defense Strategy that says we need to work more closely with our allies and partners. This National Defense Strategy, more than any other that I've seen before, explicitly recognizes that the United States has a strategic advantage over our potential adversaries because we really have allies. We have common interests. And increasing interoperability with our allies benefits us tremendously. So the possibility of having light attack as one of the ways in which allies and partners can develop their capabilities in a way that's interoperable with the United States from the very beginning is part of this strategy. With that, perhaps I'll stop there and we can kind of open it up to questions. I know there's some folks from the media here who probably all clung down front, but maybe if we could start out with some of the business people and investors if you have questions, and then we'll kind of roll into some of the media questions and do it that way. Yes, sir.
So you outlined a very important in the Air Force and a hoped-for budget, some portion, hopefully a major portion of what you'll get. How do you think that's all going to work out? That is, how much of what you need to do are you actually going to get?
Well,
your estimate.
FY18 budget, I think they're working through the final bits of it, and we've, having worked on Capitol Hill, served in the Congress for 10 years, I know that nothing is for certain until long after it happens. But it does look as though they're coming to agreement on a fiscal year 18 budget. The United States Air Force we have not been sequestering ourselves or operating on last year's budget. So we don't have the problem of how do we how do we ramp up expenditure in the last 6 months when we were underspending the first 6. So there was a certain amount of risk with that decision. But we have been operating as though we would get the FY18 budget roughly where we expect it to be. What we will have to do in the last 6 months is a lot of the new contract starts will be compressed into that 6 months, and that's difficult to do, as you well know. So I think the FY18 budget is looking very healthy, and then FY19 we have an established top line that's been agreed to by the administration and the Congress. That's pretty unprecedented. And so now the services have to build the most lethal joint force we can under that top line and be prepared to execute. I think the challenge will be for the Congress is to try to get that budget passed as close to the 1st of October as we can, so that we can execute in a normal way and try to get back to the normal process of budgeting. But I'm more hopeful now than I have been in quite a few years that we might get to normalcy. And the increased top line is significant for us, Marty. It really allowed us to do some of the things that the Air Force had to delay for a long time. It's really, really significant. Yes, sir.
Secretary Wilson, I'm Harlan Ullman. Thank you for your comments. I'd like to return to the subject of China. As you know, Bob Gates remarkably noted that anybody who wants to get engaged in a land war in China needs to have their head examined. One aspect of the strategy calls for us to be able to deter and, if necessary, defeat China. I'm curious as to how you see us doing both.
Well, with respect to China and the Air Force, I mean, we look at the Indo-Pacific and our vital national interests there and where the world is going. I mean, if you look at where the GDP of the world is, where the population of the world is, it is in the Indo-Pacific region. And we also see China developing capabilities and doing things which could challenge the rules-based order, and rules-based international order, challenge and threaten its neighbors. And you know, our view is that we want to support prosperity and freedom and a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. Our responsibility as the Air Force is to be able to project force as and when needed, to maintain the capabilities to deter any action by anybody who would challenge our vital national interests in the Indo-Pacific. And so the strategy is set out in the National Defense Strategy is to develop strong military capabilities. You know, the best way to deter conflict is to be ready to fight one and fight one effectively. And so it's working in concert with allies and partners, preparing for and being ready for a lethal high-end fight to make any country think twice about challenging the United States' vital national interests. And that's what we're seeking to do. Yes, sir.
Sorry. Bill Sweetman with Northrop Grumman. To talk about the previous administration and Bob Gates again, one of his pushes, and obviously it affected the Air Force very deeply, was to expand the force of Reaper RPAs. Mm-hmm. Now, you talked about things not being survivable in a contested environment, and I would think that would be the poster child for that kind of capability. What sort of direction do you expect to take the RPA force in, given the cost implications of going to more survivable solutions?
In this year's budget for FY19, we're actually buying 29 more MQ-9 Reapers and one more RQ-4 Global Hawk. That'll bring us, we currently have 29 squadrons of MQ-9s. We're, of course, divesting of the rest of the MQ-1s. We also have some other aircraft, the RQ-170, for example. So the United States Air Force has shifted significantly to a mix of manned and unmanned platforms. So we have 55 fighter and attack squadrons. We have 29 remotely piloted aircraft attack and surveillance squadrons. So it's a mixture of things. And you know, you use those capabilities and plan combat with a mix of capabilities at any time. I would say that one of the things that the RQ-9 and the Global Hawk does for us is they are more sensors in the air that help us with battlefield command and control if we can integrate those sensors. The Chief of Staff and I were forward in Iraq when the battle for Tal Afar was launched against ISIS. And one of the things that was amazing to me was the number of sensors in the air before that fight started. And if you can integrate those sensors and the information coming off of them, you get a much better picture of what's going on in the battle space. Sir.
Hi, ma'am. Om Prakash from Northrop Grumman also. In your light attack conversation, you mentioned the role that allies would play. Have any allies expressed interest in what you've outlined so far? At the open day that we had at Holloman, when we did the experiment, there were probably a dozen allies and partners there, kind of learning more, seeing what we were doing. And so I think that will grow, and our intention is to engage allies in this process, show them what we're doing. And I think there's an appeal of this. You know, one of the things is if the United States buys them, you can be interoperable from the very beginning. Of course, we have a lot of
people from all over the world training their air forces in the United States, not only at Shepherd Air Force Base, but at other Air Force bases around the country. And so there's the opportunity to start out training together as well. And in some ways, we always think of interoperability from an equipment point of view, and that's important. But I think even more important is the airmen training and working together from the very beginning, because that makes it much easier to be coalition at the core. So I think we will have interest as we go forward, and we will work with our allies and partners throughout the process. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. John Harper with National Defense Magazine. You noted that you only have about 6 months, or we're already 6 months into the fiscal year. Once you get appropriations for FY18, do you intend to ask lawmakers for the authority to carry some of that funding over into FY19?
There's discussions that are currently going on as to what kinds of authorities we would have. Honestly, I think the Air Force has done pretty well at execution, and we think we're okay, although I know there's discussions going on as to how much we have to have executed from our budget by the end of the third quarter, and whether that would shift some, and also some things with respect to how much money we can carry over. And those negotiations are kind of happening real time to give us the flexibility we need to execute smartly, because we don't want people or a contracting officer, signing the contract because he's got to meet some deadline on the 31st or of July or the 30th of September, when that contracting officer says, something, if I had more time, I'd get more value for money, or I'd put it at a higher priority. So I give a lot of credit to the folks who are working this on Capitol Hill, and the appropriations staff and members, as well as the DoD comptroller, who's doing a great job to give us the flexibility we need to use the money in a lethal way.
And you noted the growing threats to our space assets. I noticed in the FY19 request, funding for space programs would increase, but I believe funding for procurement would actually decrease. So can you kind of explain or flesh out why that's the case?
It all has to do with where the money, well, two things. First of all, remember, all you're seeing is the white budget. Second, it really has to do with where they are in the procurement cycle as to how much is in research, development, test, and evaluation, and then how much is in procurement as such. So I think in some ways it may be a little bit misleading. Does a red light mean something for me? Last question.
Can I ask the last question?
Last question.
Thank you. Sandra Irwin with Space News. I wanted to ask you about the new Vice Commander of Space Command. That will be a new position working with you. Can you give us a little sense of what this new Vice Commander will be doing for the operationalizing of space, and also what relationship will he have with OSD in terms of how they would work, policies and things like that? Thank you.
We are establishing a Vice Commander of Space Command, and we're in the midst of going through confirmation and so forth there. The intention is try to strengthen, Space Command and give a little more capability there. The commander of Space Command is in Colorado Springs, Colorado. He spends a heck of a lot of time going back and forth to Washington, D.C., so we're in a situation where we were making significant changes in space to recognize that it is a contested domain. That requires a lot of talking with a lot of people, a lot of change in the way in which we're managing programs, the way we're training our people, the way we're canceling SBIRS 7 and 8 and moving to an accelerated, much more agile missile warning set of satellites. We have very deep and close partnerships with the NRO. So at a time when you're doing significant change to recognize the change in the threat, you need really good people on the team. And so strengthening that team is something the Chief and I are trying to do. The United States has been dominant in space for a long time, but we built a glass house before the invention of stones. And so we are now in a situation where we're being threatened we have vital capabilities on orbit. There's a lot of change in the commercial space world as well. I mean, space is now rapidly becoming a common domain for human endeavor. And so we've got to deal with that in the training of our people, the designing of our programs, the changing of our doctrine and our strategies. This is a significant change. And I think it also recognizes the Vice President of the United States has stood up the Space Council. We've got a lot of things going on. And I'm really pleased with the way we're tackling those problems in the Air Force and with our inter-service partners in the NRO.
Hey, good morning, ma'am. Rachel Karras with Inside the Air Force. So you mentioned multi-domain operations, and General Saltzman has recommended that you stand up an MDC-2 cadre. I think it's the 13 O's. But I've heard that leadership has some...
I don't do acronyms. I have this thing. It's like $1 per acronym in my office.
That's great. Fewer acronyms, the better.
NBC2, what was the one you just used?
It just the group of personnel to handle multi-domain operations.
Okay.
But I've heard that leadership has concerns about how to address growing that group of people at the same time as you're trying to stem off the pilot shortage. So could you just talk about what you think the best way forward is on
Sure.
that?
First of all, there are two different problem sets. The pilot shortage is not a situation of how do we grow the number of people. It's how do we fill the slots that we have and retain people. So that's not an issue there. With respect to command and control, it's really actually an interesting and important discussion. How do you grow a career field where their expertise is command and control? And also in the wake of sequester, the Air Force lost some of its capability kind of at the numbered Air Force level to do command and control, to be able to set up anywhere in the world a system of command and control, whether it's on the West Africa because of Ebola or an island in the Pacific because of a hurricane. And so how do you create that career field and grow it up so that you get a meaningful career path all the way along the way? And it probably starts with the organization of those task forces at the squadron level, and then up there to the wing, the group, the numbered Air Force, so that we have a real healthy career field. If you try to do it just at the mid-career level, it never usually works. It's not really sustainable over time because you can't develop people that way. But it's actually an interesting question we're trying to deal with on how do we restore the ability to do command and control. The other piece of it also is we've gotten used to an environment for 27 years in the Middle East where we have a very large combat operations center that's well established, that's got 1,000 people, that's uncontested. Nobody can keep us from talking to each other. And so we've got pretty exquisite command and control. We need to be preparing our airmen for an environment of degraded command and control. So where they may have mission orders, but they've got distributed command and distributed execution. So it's going to be a different kind of fight, and we're thinking through what that means for one of our core missions, which is effective command, control, and communications. And Jim, I think does it sign off? Thank you.